Hi everyone, my name is Pierce. I'm the director of the Transnational Literature Series here at Brookline Booksmith and your host for tonight's conversation. I want to open up the space by saying thank you for coming out tonight. The Booksmith has been around since 1961 and it's because of our wonderful community. Your support means we can keep having events like this, so thank you again. As you may know, tonight's event is part of our ongoing Transnational Literature Series, which focuses on stories of migration, the intersection of politics and literature, and works in translation. If you enjoyed tonight's event, please check out our full events lineup online at brooklinebooksmith.com so you don't miss some of the amazing authors we have coming up this spring, both virtually and in store. You can also follow us on Instagram for updates. Toward the end of the event, we'll leave about 15 minutes or so for an audience Q&A followed by a signing. We have copies of tonight's featured book available over at the register. And please take a moment to silence your cell phones. I think that takes care of the business end of things. Now I'd love to tell you a little bit about our guests. Tonight I have the very great honor of introducing Jen Stout and Emily Channell-Justice, here to discuss and honor the release of Night Train to Odessa, a deeply moving account of the human cost of Russia's invasion into Ukraine from a journalist who has been called one of the most potent war correspondents of her generation. Jen Stout is a journalist, writer, and radio producer from Scotland, frequently working in Ukraine. Originally from Shetland, she has lived in Germany and Russia. Her empathetic and vivid coverage on the deportations in the Kharkiv region was shortlisted for an Amnesty Media Award. And her first book, tonight's featured book, Night Train to Odessa, was a BBC Radio 4 Book of the Week and won the Saltaire Society First Book of the Year Award. And tonight's moderator, Emily Channell-Justice, is the director of the Contemporary Ukraine program at the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard University. She is a sociocultural anthropologist and has been doing research in Ukraine since 2012. Her book, Without the State, Self-Organization and Political Activism, won the 2023 American Association of Ukrainian Studies Book Prize. She is also the editor of Decolonizing Queer Experience, LGBT+ Narratives from Eastern Europe and Eurasia. I'm so pleased to have them here together in conversation. And now Jen and Emily.
Okay, I'm going to start here, just to do a quick reading, and then we'll have a conversation. Thank you all very much. It's very nice to be here. This is my first time in the US. I'm like 3 days in, so I'm a bit discombobulated. Okay, I'll jump in. This excerpt is from a few weeks into the full-scale invasion. I had been in Romania for a few weeks. I started off in Moscow, which is where the book starts, and then we left very abruptly, and I went to Romania to cover the refugee crisis down in the southeast of the country, where the Danube forms the border between Ukraine and Romania. And it was over the Danube that I went one very early morning to go into Ukraine and start reporting there. The barge moved slowly towards the black sliver of land on the other side of the Danube. All around us, the deep ink blue of the fading night became a soft sunrise gold as it met the land, almost perfectly reflected in the river's still waters. I shivered, leaning on the low metal railing and watching Ukraine come into view. Fireflies darted about, their strange halting dashes leaving an imprint on my tired eyes when I rubbed them, and swallows and swifts greeted the boat as we approached the shore. To the starboard side, a small fishing boat slipped past, the prow high as the outboard motor churned the water, and the wake it made swirled the vivid hues of the sky like paints mixing. 2 Red Cross workers were watching the shore too, smoking roll-ups, and we talked for a minute about the unseasonable cold that we hadn't prepared for, about the beauty of the Delta region and where they were heading. These young men from Greece had never been to Ukraine. They'd barely given it a thought before the war, and the apprehension was written all over their faces. The huge lorries which crammed the deck, gleaming new and emblazoned with logos of humanitarian organisations, roared one by one into life, the cacophony breaking the near peace of this Danube sunrise hour. I found our little red van and hopped in, blowing on my frozen hands. Valery greeted me, ticking me off for getting so cold. He was a retired doctor who'd been working with Marianne and other volunteers to get medical supplies for this run. We talked in Russian, but like many people in this border region, he could speak Romanian and Ukrainian too. In the long Orlivka queue, I sat in the chilly cab while Valery disappeared into port buildings with our paperwork, and by mid-morning, we were allowed through. It could have taken a day or more to get through all the checkpoints to Odessa, but we had a golden ticket. Anya, our military escort, who met us an hour into the journey, turning up at a roadside coffee shop in an ancient little car. Because Valeri supplies were going to Odessa's military hospital, Anya would escort us all the way, and this was a godsend. She was a young woman of stony determination and appalling driving style. She jumped into the van, stuck on some patriotic tunes, and put her foot down. It remained there. As we approached the queues of cars waiting at a checkpoint, she would drive, skidding down the dusty edge of the road, or simply head straight into oncoming traffic, honking the horn. I thought this was fantastic, having grown up with island driving, but poor Valeri, wedged in alongside me in the van's small cab, was gripping the seat and pleading with Anya to slow down. "This woman," he kept exclaiming, "she'll get us killed! Oi, what a girl!" And she laughed, thrusting her military credentials out of the window to flash at outraged drivers and bewildered young soldiers. She was a force of nature nobody would stop, and we reached Odessa by lunchtime, somehow still in one piece. Thanks.
Thank you. I like that selection to begin because I think it shows us two kind of recurring, I don't know if themes is the right word, but sort of tropes that come out in this book. One of them is vivid portraits of the people that you come into contact with throughout this experience. I found them to be so, human. Of course, they're human, right? But in a way where you have you bring them to life. They jump right off the page, but we all also know that they are absolutely real people doing totally extraordinary things. And so I think that is really well captured in that anecdote. And the other is really captured in that anecdote is how huge. I think this is something that a lot of Americans don't actually know.
Listen, a lot of Europeans don't.
It's massive, right? And not only is it massive in terms of, from one side to the other could take 2 days, but in terms of diverse landscapes, in terms of different kinds of people, different kinds of languages, different histories. So what would you like to say about your book from those two very large kind of themes, people and places?
People and places, yeah. I didn't realize I didn't know I could write a book until I started to do this, and thankfully I could. But I didn't realize how much I write. I think I'm affected by place. So a friend of mine, when he was proofreading it, said, "Jen, I've never known anyone who romanticizes places as much as you do," which I think is fine. You're not lying about it. You're just finding so much beauty in it, I think. And yeah, the thing about Ukraine, there is a stereotype in Europe, in the UK for sure. A lot of people, if they know where it is, they would think post-Soviet, grey, miserable, grim, and they don't know. They don't know that it's huge, it's massively rich in resources, in landscapes, that there's all these cities that are utterly different from one another. And I wanted to pick at that stereotype in the book. I wanted to explain to people just how extraordinary this country is. And I guess because when people are worrying about you and you're in a war zone and you kind of want to tell them, no, guy, I'm standing on a river watching birds. I'm in Odessa, one of the most beautiful cities in the world. This isn't just some apocalyptic landscape. This is an extraordinary. Yes, of course, there are so many terrible things happening, and there's a lot of that in the book. But there's so much beauty, and at that time especially, and still now, there's so much good as well. So much solidarity and collective effort, and people joining together to do something they didn't know that they could do before. And so yeah, of course I wanted to reflect that as well in the people, and partly I can do that because I'm not a staff correspondent. I'm freelance and I'm kind of roaming around, getting lifts from people, as you heard in that anecdote, and I'd have the time to sit at a kitchen table and speak to people for a long time and really dig under the surface a bit. And then you get to know people, and a lot of the people I was traveling with would be my friends as well, and I wanted to paint a
Yeah, I apologize. Study of people we care about, the people that we work with. So I think it's a real challenge sometimes to kind of something in what could be considered an objective way, right, or a scientific way when you're still talking about people's lives, right? And I think it's especially difficult in this context because you're covering a war. A war is happening. People are doing things that they, wouldn't in their lives ever balance, telling a story about a person that kind of keeps them, keeps the person as the story will also major issues people need to learn about.
In that I did more and more long form reporting, right? So if you're writing breaking news, there is no room for personality, there is no room for colour, as we call it, or atmosphere, place. So, short quote for one person, and it's you interview someone, they think it's all in the piece, and then they get one sentence and they don't understand why, and then they're and I understand, they got like 400 words for a breaking news article. So yeah, and I was writing for a news, have a bit more space and time to talk, and then long form radio, let the personality come out. But obviously, as I said, that requires you to have a personality as well, right? And to give, if you can sit down with people and tell them a bit about yourself as well, then that's really great because it doesn't feel as extractive, right?
Yeah.
And I could tell, people often they would say, "What the hell are you doing here? Like strange women on your own with no fixer or team." And I would say, well, this is where I'm from, actually. I'm from this tiny island, it's like the smallest inhabited island in Scotland. And that would usually pique some interest, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that developing that kind of relationship also allows you to tell a story in a more honest way. I think what you have achieved in this book is also not to, you already said romanticize, so I'll use that word again, not to romanticize what's happening as Ukrainian resilience is magic, or that everyone in Ukraine is a superhero, right?
Yeah.
Which maybe is sort of true, but also it's not okay, right? This is a situation hoisted upon people that they have no control over, and they're trying to do the best that they can in this context. And so I think it's really important to take the time, to be able to make sure that you also tell stories about people like going to concerts and having clubs underground, and one of my favorite anecdotes is about the woman who run the hotel in Kyiv who just fried potatoes when you show up, it's, which I'm sure is one of your fondest memories as well.
Yeah, there's apparently I didn't again mean to do this, but the book is actually full of food. There's loads and loads about food in it. Partly because right, and this is no shade at all on other writers, but often in like correspondence books of reportage, I would read them thinking, right, that's really interesting, but what were you eating? Where were you sleeping? Like, who were you talking to? What were you thinking? How were you feeling? And I wanted to put all of that in because it's relatable. Right?
Yeah, and I think it makes it. For me, again, anthropologist, so I have a complex relationship with how much the author should be in the text. But I think it also kind of helps people understand your relationship to the people you're talking about, and that you aren't just there to get a story about and you cover some really tragic and really horrific things, and things that we've all been reading about for 3 years, right? It's not as if you're just generating, fluffy stories to make people feel better about Ukraine, right? You can just talk about Volodymyr Vokolenko. Like, these are really difficult stories.
Yeah. Yes, they are. I could have, well, no, but I could have filled, the book could have been entirely 100% grim, and I really didn't want to do that. Yeah.
So maybe, actually, that's a nice segue to reading another passage that highlights some of the people that you met. I think we've picked a couple of them. Yeah, I like that one.
Okay. Yeah, so the book is well named, not by me. I wish I could claim I came up with the title, but most journalists are terrible at thinking up headlines, by the way, so it's true. I really hate doing it. So my agent, I think, came up with the title of the book, and I did take a lot of night trains because the night trains in Ukraine are excellent. You get bed linen, you get to lie down, they make you tea sometimes, it's fantastic. And again, it's such a big country, and I can travel from one end to the other for like £10. That's really, really helpful when you're a freelancer. Anyway, big fan of the train. So I was on a train one time, and it's also a great way to meet people and talk to people when you're traveling alone, especially. And I'd been in Kharkiv doing some reporting. I was, as usual, very, very tired, and I'd actually blown my eardrum out. I didn't know you could do that, but I had. Didn't realise. Anyway. The problem with a late night train during curfew and blackout is probably obvious. The trains leave well after curfew descends, so you have to arrive hours too early. I had enjoyed the sunset outside Kharkiv's magnificent train station, its 2 towers and tall columns, the perfect stage for a flight of swallows playing in the evening light. But now it was dark, and there was another hour to wait, and I was slumped down under my flak jacket and rucksack, half sitting against the wall of the dimly lit underpass. I looked around at my potential fellow passengers, hoping I wouldn't get stuck in the coupe, a 4-person compartment with some snoring bloke, it does happen, and spotted 2 young women in uniform. I caught a few words of English from their murmured conversation. I bet I end up sharing with them, I thought. In the scrum down the tunnel, I lost them, but sure enough, they reappeared in my compartment. They were both quiet, thoughtful women. I had the last of a plastic bottle of cherry liqueur someone had given me and shared out the dregs. One girl was nicknamed Kasia, and she revealed cautiously that she was Belarusian. The way she talked about her role in this fight was poignant. Freedom for Ukraine would hopefully lead to freedom for her own country too, an end to the tyranny of Putin's puppet, Lukashenko. Having joined the Ukrainian armed forces, she had essentially barred her own way home. Her mother was still there. And she said all this in a matter-of-fact way. She was doing what was necessary, no need for emotions. Lev, meanwhile, was Canadian. No one could mistake that accent. But I was staggered to hear how she had got here. A full 10 years younger than me, she was already a seasoned army medic. At home in Canada years ago, she'd read about the Kurdish fight in Rojava, northern Syria, and about the feminist left-wing revolution taking place there under threat from ISIS. It said you could donate, or better, you could go and help as a medic, she recalled. And I was like, that's great, because I don't have any money. I guess I'll just go there. And she laughed. Lev had spent years in that grim fight against Islamic State, years which I could not imagine and which she didn't go into. When the war in Ukraine really kicked off, she said, it was a natural choice to come and volunteer. She believed in the cause and she had skills that they needed. The 2 women had been paired up because Kasia could translate, and you could tell they'd been spending all their time together under intense pressure. There was an invisible piece of string between them. I watched them from the opposite bunk during a lull in conversation and saw they were communicating without words. That kind of bond, that kind of closeness is hard won. Lev and I went to the end of the rocking carriage to smoke cigarettes in the chilly air. This had been banned on Ukrainian trains, which was annoying, and at first the conductor had flatly refused our request. But 10 minutes later, she reappeared and whispered that we could smoke if no one saw us, and even winked. I told Lev briefly about the last few months and the reporting that I was doing now. I mentioned the long, rambling diary that I kept religiously, a compulsion to get everything down on paper before memory mushed it up or let it slip away. Yeah, I kept a diary for a while, she mused, but it got too dark. She had lost a lot of good people in Syria, good friends. I looked at Lev, her face just visible. She dragged on her cigarette and it flared briefly in the dark. She looked so young, rosy cheeks and a shy smile. But there was something about her, something I couldn't pin down, which was making a deep impression on me, a stillness at her centre, a quiet certainty. I was thinking how embarrassingly awestruck I was by this person when she turned to me and said, "It's so brave what you're doing." I was completely taken aback. What I'm doing? Are you serious? You're a frontline medic and it's not even your own country. And she just smiled back, Buddha-like, nodding slowly.
You have a lot of characters in the book, too. I say characters, but who are a lot of them are Ukrainian, a lot of them are not Ukrainian. Tell us maybe a little bit more about the landscape of journalism at the time of most of your coverage. I think for most of us who follow what's going on in the war, it was obvious that a lot of people showed up in Ukraine to talk about the war. I found here in the US, there was always a lot of information circulating and not a lot of knowledge about how to parse through, where people were talking from, what kind of experience they had, that sort of thing. You're very transparent in your book that you come from Moscow, basically. You're spending this time in Moscow on a fellowship. You are a Russian speaker, but you come to Ukraine via Romania. You start in Odessa, you clearly have a lot of connections in Kharkiv, which is eastern Ukraine. So tell us a little bit more about some of these other international figures or journalism in general.
So in the beginning of full-scale invasion, there were a lot of, and a lot of them were very, very good, and some of them were like bloggers who did a lot of YouTube, and their reports would be like, look, it's me again, it's me. If your report always has your face in the middle of it, it's slightly wrong. Yeah, and also, I'm a really big stick with like journalism experience and training, because particularly when you're reporting on terrible things, you need an understanding of like ethics of it, some of the rules about it. So there were, for instance, there were people standing in front of, where a missile had hit, and they'd show dead bodies. And we don't do that because the families haven't been informed yet, but they didn't know that, and it made a good picture, and they could do it on YouTube and say, here's me. And they would say things like, I stand with Zelensky and Putin is a war criminal. And look, I kind of agree, but I'm not going to say that because I'm a journalist. It's not my role to say that I'm on one side or the other. So yeah, that stuff was frustrating, but it brought a lot more attention to the situation. So yeah, there were fewer, you could see the sort of trick. There were fewer journalists covering the story. I remember being a year and a half ago maybe, and someone said to me, Ukrainian, it'll be like Iraq, for the anniversary. And that was so depressing.
Just earlier this week at Harvard, I hosted an event with my colleague from the Georgia program, and we hosted this event about journalism. And we had a journalist who works in Ukraine, a journalist who works in Georgia, and then a journalist who's worked in both places. He's of the legacy media variety, and we had a pretty robust conversation about objectivity, and especially in the context of journalism in Ukraine. And one of the reasons was because the journalist who covers Ukraine, he's Ukrainian American, and as part of his sort of storytelling, he embeds with drone units or embeds with other frontline units, but he takes them drones every time. And one of the comments in the discussion was, well, are you really doing good journalism if you're taking these units drones, right? Don't you automatically come to that with this biased perspective? One of the legacy journalism guy basically said, objectivity isn't about telling both sides of the story, it's about being on the side of truth, and wherever the truth is, that's where journalists should be going. And I wanted you to reflect on that, from this experience, it feels like, you're telling a certain story, right? Obviously you're talking to, people you never insert, what does Russia think, as part of the narrative, right? And so, yeah, I wonder if you have any thoughts about that. I know, easy question, I'm just dropping objectivity.
Yeah. It's been a huge test of all these big questions, I think, because, look, I am not neutral when it comes to fascism. I just don't think that I should be. But as long as I say that and I'm open about that, I think that's okay. In a lot of international reporting, in the beginning, they'd always have this little quote from, like, if they got some quote from the Russian ministry being like, we did nothing wrong, and they're like, well, and eventually people are like, what's the point? Because it's just nonsense. Like, what's the point of quoting a source which every single time is lying? And so that's by and large gone. Also, we can't report on the Russian side. It's not like we're choosing not to. We can't. But then, yeah. So I could say I have a position in this. I understand what's right and wrong in this. But if the Ukrainian army did something bad, I would report on that. I wouldn't hold back because of my own allegiances. But yeah, as you understand, like when you live in a country and your friends are there and they're fighting this existential thing. You naturally kind of have sympathies with that, don't you?
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, and I think, for me, someone who's been working in Ukraine since 2012 and who has largely worked with activists, so I largely worked with groups of student activists, these were people who were inherently critical of what was happening in Ukraine.
Yeah.
And they weren't critical because they hated Ukraine, they were critical because they love Ukraine.
Right.
And I think that's something that is really difficult understand sometimes. You don't fight for things to be better because maybe you don't like the way that they are. It's not because you don't, it's not that you don't believe Ukraine should exist. You want to live in a Ukraine accepting of all types of people and all different political beliefs in the case of the people that I worked with.
I come from before I was a journalist, I was very I was an activist. I was very involved in lots of campaigns, and that didn't leave me. I just, I went to work for the BBC, where you have to have no opinion, and it was good. I had to learn how to shut up. It was necessary. It was a necessary stage of my development as a, you know. And I think BBC journalists we shouldn't know their opinion, right? We shouldn't. If you're like CNN, that whatever, because you can't then report objectively. You're taken seriously. I think when you're doing like long form stuff, writing books, you can have slightly more of a foot in the game. But yeah, I mean, so the civic activism that I've been involved in, I found in Ukraine like times 1,000. Like, my God, those people know how to create a better country and how to fight against corruption and Russia and everything else that's terrible. I mean, they've really, it's incredibly inspiring to be there. Yeah. Even especially now, I guess.
Yeah. I just, if you're interested, there's a student organization that I worked with for many years that has like a rejuvenation. They have a Telegram channel that is filled with things that they are critical about the Ukrainian government to, and then there will be a fundraiser. Our friend X has a friend on the front lines. We'd like to buy this many tourniquets for them. Let's raise the money. 2 hours later, money is raised, right? And I think it's because people have, again, this sense, and I'm saying all this from my side because I think you have anecdotes within this book that also tell that story that I'm going to have you read if you don't mind. Because I think that fundamental belief, that we want to create a country that we can all live in together is part of what people are fighting for, and I think that's really nicely captured in your text.
Yeah, so because of my background and all of this, when I'd first gone to Ukraine, it was activists that I met up with. I met LGBT activists and other journalists, and in fact, Behus, one of the biggest investigative journalists in Ukraine, is now in the army, and it's not like he loves the state. He's pretty critical, but he understands, just like Ivana in this story, that the existential threat of Russia is like the bigger thing to deal with. So this is, it's an anecdote about my friend Ivana, who's a hero of this book. She hates me calling her a hero, but she really is. She's someone who's, her background is like cultural projects and theatre and poetry, but for years and years her life has been kind of derailed by the war, and I don't just mean the last like 3-4 years, I mean way back, because she's in Kharkiv and they know what it is to fight and to keep that city, and she fundraises and gets equipment for army units. So this is sort of May 22 in Kharkiv. I was complaining because it was, to me, incredibly hot. It was 22 degrees and I was kind of dying. So we're drinking lemonade in the park. 4 years had passed since we first met at the Pride Centre. Once a cultural manager working in the arts, she was now what was loosely termed a volunteer, fundraising, finding supplies, getting whatever was needed to brigades and to civilians. It was her life, and it turned out she was very good at it. What Ivana told me, though, went deep into the thorny, complicated politics of Kharkiv and, by extension, of Ukraine. Football ultras had long been a fixture here, the groups melding into militias when Russia first invaded in 2014. These ragtag battalions of self-organised fighters played a key role in the fighting back then because the real army was too weak thanks to years of underfunding and corruption. The best known of them all, the Azov Battalion, had its roots in Kharkiv and in the far right. It was subsequently reformed and brought fully under the control of the Ukrainian army, but Azov was not alone in this. The Freikorps group also originated in Kharkiv. It has insisted the name comes from the tendency of Western press to dub all 2014 Ukrainian militias Freikorps, a reference to the anti-communist right-wing militias in Weimar Germany, and that the group simply took on this moniker. They also enthusiastically took up the battle against gays and liberals and regularly disrupted or even attacked the nascent attempts to stage a Kharkiv Pride March. I remembered all this from 2018 and remembered my shock when the LGBTQ activists, mostly young gay women, told me then that they chipped in to fund these militia battalions, the same groups who harassed them in public. We knew they'd come for us, one had said, but what choice did we have? In 2014, Kharkiv was a key target in the Kremlin's campaign to stoke unrest and annex territory, and Russian-backed separatists worked hard to take over here as they did in Donetsk. Russian invasion for the LGBTQ activists would be horrifying. So they'd held their noses and supported the only people able to defend the country at the time. Freikorps, like the other militias, professionalised and grew. Its commander had been Georgy Tarasenko. Ivana knew him. She tried hard to persuade him that Russia was the real common enemy, not Kharkiv's leftists and queers. I told him, when the tanks roll in, we'll be on the same side, she said. It showed considerable foresight. Not many believed that tanks would really roll across the border and attack Kharkiv and Kiev, even as late as February 2022, when all signs pointed to invasion. She'd somehow seen it coming, years before, and recognised that Russia posed a greater threat, an existential threat to people like her, more than their own homegrown fascists. Her network of volunteers, buying everything from tactical gloves to medical supplies, were too important to snub, and Tarasenko had been persuaded. When the tanks did indeed roll in and Kharkiv was nearly surrounded, he led his soldiers in the battles that raged on the outskirts. And then he was killed near Malorohan a few weeks into the war. Ivana, retelling this story, paused, and then she said something extraordinary. He was the first guy I cried for in this war. He was my political opponent, but he did a great job as a young general. Political opponent made it sound like they were in divergent political parties, whereas this man virulently hated her and her friends. He stood for the kind of mindless far-right nationalism that's on the rise everywhere, Christ in the family stuff with runes and wolves thrown in for extra testosterone. It's a phenomenon all over Europe, not least in Germany and the UK, and its existence in Ukrainian society should never be glossed over, but it's wrong to pretend that it only exists there. Ivana understood all this very well, better than any Western commentator, making sweeping judgments about the situation, and yet she tried to help Tarasenko because it was pragmatic, it was necessary, and because she genuinely believed that she could get through to him. After his death, she had written, with real sincerity, on social media, describing her respect for him and the way he had defended the city. And it was met with a hail of abuse from his comrades, outraged that someone like her would so much as utter his name. She'd shrugged it off, focused on the bigger picture. There was little time to dwell on things. Hospitals and schools needed supplies, soldiers on the front needed tourniquets and bulletproof plates. And somehow she had to retain some semblance of order in her own life, resisting the urge to simply work every minute of the day.
Thank you for sharing that passage. I really felt like that was a story that embodied a lot of the things that many of us know to be true about Ukraine, and I found it really told in a really moving way. And I also see Ivana as a hero, so you can tell her that she's she doesn't get to decide.
I think I really wanted to explain to people here and in the UK that, like, for the grace of God, none of us have had to make that kind of choice,
Exactly.
right?
Mm-hmm.
But they have to.
Exactly. And I've looked a lot at the LGBTQ battalions who serve in Ukraine and LGBTQ soldiers who are basically saying, like, we have no choice, right? Like, the only way we get to fight to have the rights that we want to have is if we have a state that can, codify them into law, right?
Yeah.
And they're fighting alongside friends of mine, from student activist days are fighting alongside people who used to attack their demonstration. It's just, like you say, and you reiterate this a lot through the book also, is that it is a choice that most of us have never had to make, and it's really easy to be very far away and say, well, you should leave, or you should give up this part of that or whatever, and the way that you kind of prioritize the stories of the people who have made that decision and share it without judgment, I think is really, it's a moving way of telling the stories. I think probably we'll turn to audience questions soon, but I want to give you a chance to talk actually a little bit about Kharkiv, if you will.
Please.
It's very clear. So this is a city that, as someone who's studied Ukraine for over 10 years and who first visited Ukraine over 20 years ago, I've never actually been to. So it really came alive a lot in your text. This is a city where you have a lot of connections. For those of you unfamiliar, Kharkiv is in the far east of Ukraine, very close to the Russian border. It was the first capital of Soviet Ukraine in the 1920s, so it has a really interesting history within Ukraine. It also was the site of a lot of intellectual development throughout the early 20th century, most of which was crushed during the Stalinist period. And you have so many different stories about it, so maybe tell us a little bit more from your personal perspective about the city.
Boy, yeah, Kharkiv is a city that feels full of ideas. It feels like fast-paced and full of movement, and partly that's because it's a massive university city. There's 9, I think, universities there, and it's also an industrial hub. So this was all like, they were industrializing very, very quickly, especially when it was the capital of the Ukrainian SSR. There was a tractor factory, famously, and they first split the atom in the Soviet Union in Kharkiv. So it's an extraordinary place. It was often referred to wrongly in recent years as like, oh, well, Russian speaking, and sometimes just Russian. And that's right, people speak Russian, yeah, but for lots of slightly complicated reasons. It's not Russian. It's a thoroughly Ukrainian city, arguably more than Odessa, but we're not going to get into people say. So a lot of what people are doing in Kharkiv now in recent years has been this kind of like wartime literary activism where they're peeling back the layers and uncovering the real Ukrainian Kharkiv. So looking at figures like Shevelyov, the linguist and philosopher, and Skovoroda, and people who always found Kharkiv to be this huge source of inspiration in their intellectual development. And really, if you want to look at the kind of ideas that forms the Ukrainian nation and are forming them now, that's the place to be. So often when I go to Kharkiv during full-scale war, I'd be like, well, where's everyone? Okay, they're in this basement nightclub, and they've got Serhii Zhadan and Vakarchuk, and they're like there's like 400 people packed into this place to debate the cultural values on which Ukraine is built, and you're like, guys, there's an air raid. I mean, oh my God. And it makes me think, would we, in my society, would we respond to such threat in this way with such like intellectual endeavor and curiosity? It's absolutely, and they see it all as part of the same thing. So it's extraordinary. The other thing I would say about Kharkiv is the architecture. Oh, so imagine this city centre with like 1,000 different styles and histories and layers inside it. It's quite compact, the centre, but you can see all the history like built in front of you. And my favourite bit of that, of course, is the 1920s. And so Kharkiv, there's some great books about this, like novels that imagine. Yaro Trofimov actually wrote a novel about it's based on his grand's life in Ukraine called The Country for Love. It's beautiful and very grim, but it paints this portrait of Kharkiv as this. I mean, it was drawing in so many people, lots of like very idealistic young people who wanted to go and work on these brigades to build the new city and the new future. And one of the things that people were building was Derzprom, it used to be Gazprom. And this was built as, to house the offices of state, actually. So it's got now it's this sort of symbol of Kharkiv's resistance, also of its Ukrainian resistance, but that was a very Soviet thing. So the whole story of Derzprom and people's affiliation to it and interpretations of it can tell you a lot about loyalty, identity, and how people think of who they are and what they stand for and how to interpret the past, right? Because we all cherry pick bits of the past and say that means that and that means that, but in Kharkiv it's particularly present. So this building, you could stand and look at it, it's extraordinary. It's like all these interconnecting, white, soaring, futuristic blocks. And you would think, gosh, that must have been like the 60s or something, right? It's kind of brutalist, but it's more futuristic. They built it in the 1920s. Like, they started building this thing with like barrows and donkeys. It's mind-blowing, it's absolutely mind-blowing. And I found a picture of me in 2018, like standing in a big coat in the snow, just under the soaring arch of Derzprom and just grinning, like I'm grinning now because I've loved it so much. So the reason that it's become a symbol of the resilience of Kharkiv is because it famously, one of the many myths about it, which includes stuff like monkeys living in it and Nazis and stuff, but it's true, Kharkiv is built, Derzprom is built out of a very innovative at the time sort of steel concrete design, which is why they say the Nazis, when they mined it on departing, could not destroy it, and why Russia has not destroyed it yet, because it was all attacks. Sadly, just as I finished an essay about this and sent it off that very evening in October last year, they did hit it with a CAV, which is a really big aerial bomb. But it still stands and makes everybody very happy.
Thank you. Do you want to read any last passage before the audience questions? Or,
we could read a quick one about some. So I eventually did, when I had more training, I did some reporting closer to the front lines, and sometimes that would be with soldiers, and sometimes that was going to frontline places where they're evacuating people, which lots of people are involved in, and some have sadly died. But this is also a story about the kind of haplessness of myself and of freelance reporting. What was supposed to happen was this. I would jump in a minibus with some volunteers who every day except Sundays drove to heavily shelled places and took civilians out to safety. This evacuation run was going to Chasiv Yar, a small town 8 miles from Bakhmut. Dangerous. Another journalist had given me the number of Vlad, who was in charge, and asked if he'd like tag along, and he called back late last night. Be at the petrol station outside Sloviansk at 8 a.m. I arrived 20 minutes early, because I hate rushing. I wanted to get a coffee, but the parking lot was already full of jeeps, people in flak jackets with press across them milling around, clearly about to go somewhere. I parked my little car, Ivana's car, threw on my own vest and helmet, and ran up to them. "Are you going on the evacuation run?" I asked. Yes, said the harassed Ukrainian driver. "It's leaving now." "Well, can I jump in with you?" He looked nonplussed. "I guess so, yeah." And I squeezed in the back of the Jeep alongside other foreign reporters. The convoy began to move. I had a feeling that something was a bit off. 20 minutes went by, the roads got worse, potholed and muddy, as we began to climb a long hill. I looked at the map on my phone. I didn't want to annoy them, even the driver was less than thrilled about having me there, but I cleared my throat. "This is a funny way to go to Chasiv Yar." It was in fact the opposite direction. And there was a silence in the car. And then a French reporter said slowly, "We're not going to Chasiv Yar." The driver turned to look at me. "Who are you supposed to be with?" And I gave the name of Vlad and his group. "You're in the wrong convoy," he said. "Oh," I said, "shit." "Where are you going?" "Sibirsk," came the blunt reply, and there was another long silence. It was obviously too late to turn back, and they couldn't really chuck me out. I apologised profusely and tried to ignore the hollow feeling in the pit of my stomach that was my body shouting, "This is very bad." Sibirsk was much further away, up near the border of Luhansk Oblast. It was in the middle of what looked on the map to be a pocket surrounded by the red of Russian-held territory. I persuaded an editor to take a story from Chasiv Yar on the basis that it was coloured green on the insurance company's map, indicating my policy was still valid there, much as that meant. Sibirsk was firmly in the red zone, although to be fair, I think the map was arbitrary and shells hit both towns regularly. "The press officer will need to speak to you when we get to Sibirsk," the driver said tersely. "He's going to be pissed off." I agreed this seemed quite likely, and then kept quiet for a while as the Jeep thudded and lurched through mud-filled craters, and we crawled higher into the chalk hills. Sibirsk was quite dangerous. I'll read you a little bit of the hospital there. So it had been a normal provincial hospital with a few wards and long buildings all around. Some craters that we passed in the grounds looked fresh. The earth was black where it had been blown up. At the main door to the hospital, on a bench in the sun, a little row of old ladies sat wrapped up in shawls and coats. They didn't seem to be patients, but I was just introducing myself when it came, that menacing whistle, high-pitched and descending, and the first big bang. "Prilyot," a man shouted. It means arrival by air, incoming. The little old ladies had risen from their perch and were shuffling inside, but painfully slowly, it seemed to me. Time had started to stretch weirdly. I must not push the babushkas out of the way, I thought. Yeah, I'll finish there because it goes on quite a bit. But it was one of those scenarios where I ended up in a kind of press pack that I wouldn't usually work in, and there was a lot of people who were very sick of foreign journalists taking their picture, and I was with this whole group of foreign journalists who just would not stop doing that, and I actually found it really uncomfortable.
Yeah, and I really do appreciate you including some of that kind of sentiment within, as well as the humor that's also clearly there, because sometimes you really do just have to laugh, right?
You do.
So I think we have about 15-ish minutes or so, if anyone wants to ask a question. Yeah?
Hi.
Oh, hold on a second.
Sorry, yeah, there's
I've got the mic.
Good. So, thank you. First of all, Jen, thank you very much for coming and congratulations on the awards. I mean, absolutely, BBC Radio 4, that's a big deal, I know. My name is Vlad, I'm from Ukraine, I'm originally from Kyiv. I've been in Kharkiv many times, what you described. I have a different question for you. I know it's kind of a little bit hard, but in general, it's very important for us to understand your journey, because you started with Russian, you ended up in Moscow on the fellowship, and then, so I just want to know, you can tell us a little bit more about your understanding of, in general, Ukraine through the Russian lens, because probably at the beginning it's very important for us to tell the story to others, how it's changed through the time. Thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you, Vlad. So I started to learn Russian when I was about 15 in high school in Shetland, which is kind of unusual. And I went as a teenager. We went for a week on a school trip, and I really liked it. But I was reading like Anna Politkovskaya. I was under no illusions about what kind of state, what kind of regime it was becoming. But also reading her work made me want to become a journalist. I was impressed by what she did, and it sounded like something I'd like to do. But then I did Russian at university in Edinburgh for a couple of years, and looking back on that, I mean, even at the time, I guess, but certainly Russian is taught perhaps still in a very imperialist way. Here we are, the great Russian language with Pushkin and Dostoevsky, the pinnacle of civilization. We gave the civilization to the Georgians and everybody else. We were so gracious in our... And they honestly never really talked about Ukraine. I don't remember. But of course, I was taught many authors as Russians, but they were, of course, Ukrainian, same with artists and so on. So I think that is changing, but slowly. Obviously, it's changed in my understanding as these years have gone on. When I went to Moscow, it was on a fellowship. It was delayed with COVID. It was November 21. We were given a lot of, like, as I recall, anti-surveillance training and warned not to go near any demonstrations or misbehave in any way at all. So it was clear, like, there wasn't really much chance of doing a lot of independent journalism. I wanted to work at Nova Gazeta. That was never going to happen. And we were only there for 3.5 months, as it turned out, until February 24th, and then we left a few days after. And I wouldn't go back, ever. And there's a little bit of me every single day that is so grateful that I'm not in Moscow. I'd rather be in Donbass under the worst shelling than be in Moscow again. But yeah, does that answer your question? I think one thing I would add, though, there is a long history of Ukraine being covered with a Russian lens, as you said, and so you'd have, because news organisations they would only have a bureau in Moscow and not in Kiev until recently, and so often they were sending journalists, some with a very Russian idea of what Ukraine was, usually absolutely no Ukrainian language skills, and sort of an imperialist lens for sure, and that was massively problematic, and it has changed, probably not enough, but it's changing.
Thank you. That is very important. So it's changing.
It is.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks. Anyone else?
Go ahead.
Hey, my name is Monica. I'm not Ukrainian. I'm Polish, and I'm trying to understand my own family history because my family moved here in the 1980s, and they suffered under communism and the usual stuff. But I also have like a very loose link to Ukraine because my dad's uncle, or I think his great uncle, was a priest in Ukraine and was sent to the Gulag by the Soviets. And
He was a Catholic priest, I guess.
Catholic priest.
Yeah.
And I've been trying to understand the relationship between Poland and Ukraine and their fraught history, but also like the history of all the other like countries that border Ukraine and their relationships and what the different opinions are between what's been going on and what it will go on, and how they view the war and how they used to view it and how they view it now. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Certainly, yeah. It's a really important topic, actually. It's something that I want to write about a lot in the near future. I mean, if we talk about Romania, when I was on that border and people were leaving Ukraine they'd never left the country before. They weren't rich Ukrainians, a lot of them. And they're coming into Romania, a country where they've never been, and also where, particularly in the southern bit around Odessa, there's not exactly the easiest history between Romania and Ukraine, you could say very lightly. Like Bessarabia was Romanian, and Romanians were among the troops that killed the Jewish population of Odessa, etc., etc. However, what they were greeted with in Romania was the most extraordinary level of love. You couldn't have another word. It was such an outpouring. I was so blown away by the self-organisation, the community effort at that port. And this is in the poorest part of Romania, which is a poor part of Europe, to give people everything they had, right? To just help and help and help, and volunteers there sort of 24 hours a day. And it was a lot of Ukrainians that I interviewed, it was that when they described this, that they would actually start to cry, because they couldn't believe that they got this warm welcome. And that was really moving. And you could say the same about the border crossings in Poland, in Hungary. As time has gone on, that has shifted. And you can see far-right politicians, particularly in Romania especially, stirring this up, saying, well, they get houses and we don't have houses. And that's predictable and very sad. With the Polish truckers strike, I mean, it's sort of slightly complicated in terms of what they were angry about and why they were angry, but they did have some reason to be. You know, it wasn't just all being fabricated, which some people said it was. I mean, if you're going to be very cynical, you could say that sort of solidarity and giddy hope can only last for, like, in that form, cannot last forever. There's going to be a fracturing of it when the war just isn't end. But yeah, again, a long way, and a lot of it is about World War II and time and who did what and who was the good guy and who was the bad guy, because usually that's, you know, there isn't actually one, and particularly in that sort of the bloodlands, as Snyder has it, of Eastern Europe. A lot of that was never really discussed after the war. You know, there was just Soviet occupation and there was only one narrative, which is, we came and saved you all from the Nazis, hooray! And if you grew up in that time and that land, knowing that your father or your uncle or your granddad, he actually fought against the Soviets, and who was he fighting with and why were they doing that, it gets very, very complicated. But because of that long period of total silence and oppression of history, none of it was really dealt with. And now you have this like festering wound in so many countries, I think, is my impression. What do you think?
I feel like I've heard like different.
Sorry, can you wait for the mic so that, thank you.
Because like I would hear my father, because he's a very stoic Polish man.
Sure.
And he was very help the Ukrainians at first, and then I'd hear all these narratives of World War II, Ukraine bad, or like Polish people bad, or whatever, because like different people did different things during the war.
They did.
But there's also like the silence that you speak of is not just like the silence between nations and not wanting to discuss what happened because Russia's always been bad, but it's also like maybe there's also these other layers of things that were never just dealt with.
Yeah.
And it's also like within everyone's families, because I found out what happened on my mother's side from my father because the village knew about it, but her family doesn't talk about it.
Yeah.
So there's all these like small little familial wounds that are happening that are also like a small glimmer of what's happening within all of these different countries, that they just need to sit down and talk, but no one's going to sit down and talk because everyone's been focused on Russia being bad for so long.
Sure. Yeah, and that you could say similar things about what's happened in Russia. Like, there is no real historical memory in Russia. And there was when there was sort of Memorial and these activists trying to say, gosh, look, all these people were killed, so we sort of talk about that and remember that and maybe have a memorial to them. And that's all been, as they term, liquidated. And so for Russia, you know, speaking to a lot of Russians that at the time, their understanding of what happened in World War II was this pure kind of victimhood. Like we saved everybody and they weren't grateful. And no one that I spoke to there actually really had studied fascism and what the Nazis stood for. They just used the word fascist to be like anyone who was against us. So Polish partisans, Belarusian partisans, Ukrainian they were all fascists. But then Russians can't see. There was this gap in that society where people often couldn't see, those who were supporting the war, that what their government was doing was becoming the same thing. So I think, yeah, there is this huge sort of silence and gap in that part of the world where things can repeat themselves.
I feel like the newer generations are trying to get along, like the young ones, because one of my best friends is Ukrainian, and then we hear things from our families, and it's like, how do you deal with that? And like, my tattoo artist is Russian, and she's like, I'm one of the good guys. And it's just like, she's aware of what happened. It's like the older generations don't really want to deal with the history like that. Yeah.
One comment, one thing.
Visit Europe. The city of Frankfurt, which created Ukraine-Polish department. So if you're interested in the Ukrainian-Polish studies, I would strongly recommend you to contact them. I think one of the people at Turi actually doing seeing what they're doing. About each other and talking to each other. I think this is what you do. And the Professor Portnov and others who were there, they're Ukrainians and Polish scientists, historians, who have no problem to discuss hard issues. Because you're absolutely correct. If you don't discuss it, goes underground, never gonna be resolved. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and a key part of this story also is just the simple question of access to historical information. You know, the Soviet archives were not open to answer any of these questions for many. The history was intentionally repressed so as, you know, to make life easier for the Russian narrative to be the most successful one. So, you know, even I think that makes it harder now for Ukrainians today to want to grapple with these historical clashes with Poland, right? They need Poland to be their ally against Russia, and so it's really difficult to actually get over some of these humps. But it's also, you know, it's also the fault of simply not having actual information on purpose, right? So I think it's easier maybe to see what we don't know without knowing what we necessarily know, and that makes it hard to enter into these conversations. So I think this is a big question. I
think that's a really great point.
Oh, is it I had seen a question in the back, but it's okay if we don't have enough time.
Do we have a question? Jason have a question. Yes, Jason is always welcome to ask too.
Hello. So I have no connection to Ukraine at all. But I was wondering, something that came through to me as you were reading the excerpts from your book, as we're talking, is that a lot of the perception of people like me who have no tie to Ukraine is that life just kind of stops. And that, but like one thing that came through to me is like, oh, life doesn't just stop. Like there are still life just goes on as in wartime and stuff like that. And I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Yeah.
And like what the kind of, not just the American perception is, but like what people's perception is of periods like this.
No, totally. Look, you find the same perception in the UK and you find it in Poland, right? And it's a really difficult one for journalists. So I was doing a report in Kiev once, and I described how the missile had fallen onto a busy intersection during rush hour, and it killed a lot of people. And the presenter that I was talking to on the radio said, "What do you mean?" He was really taken aback, like, "What do you mean rush hour?" Right? Because, of course, to me, I'm like, well, there's millions of people in Ukraine, and like, there's